The bottle shattered against the marble pillar a breath away from Marina Whitlock's head, and she did not flinch. She had worked the night shift at Obsidian long enough to know that broken glass and spilled blood were simply part of the atmosphere here, that the elegant darkness of this underground club was not decorative but functional, that the beautiful pale creatures who lounged in its velvet booths and whispered across its lacquered bar were not wearing costumes. She had known all of that for exactly 4 months, ever since the man who hired her had looked into her eyes with irises the color of storm clouds and told her, simply, that if she could not keep a secret, she should walk away and never return. She had stayed. But tonight something was wrong in a way that went beyond spilled bourbon and aristocratic tempers. The man at the center of the room, the one every other creature in the building watched with the kind of reverent terror that Marina associated with footage of natural disasters, was disappearing. Not literally. Not yet. But she could see it happening the way you could see a candle guttering before it went dark. Silas Skorzeny, Vampire King of the Northeastern Court, sovereign of 3 bloodlines, ancient and untouchable and impossibly beautiful in his white suit and his white hair and his depthless silver eyes, was leaning against the back wall of his own throne room like a man who had forgotten how to stand upright. His skin, always pale as carved alabaster, had taken on a grey translucency that alarmed her in a way she could not fully articulate. The veins at his temples were dark, visible, spiderwebbing outward like cracks in porcelain. The other vampires in the room were keeping their distance. That told Marina everything she needed to know about how dangerous the situation truly was. These were creatures who fed on power the way they fed on blood. They did not retreat from weakness, they circled it. She picked up her tray and walked toward him. Miss Whitlock. The warning came from Casimir Vrail, Silas's second, a narrow-faced vampire with iron-grey hair and eyes like polished obsidian. He stepped into her path with the casual authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. You will return to the bar. He looks like he's about to fall over, Marina said. Her voice was steady. She had long ago decided that the only way to survive in a room full of apex predators was to refuse to smell like prey. Someone should make sure he doesn't. His Majesty requires no assistance from a human. His Majesty, Marina said, stepping around Casimir with the practiced efficiency of someone who had navigated Saturday night dinner, rushes with a full tray in each hand. Looks like he disagrees. She reached Silas before anyone else could move to stop her. Up close, the wrongness was worse. His breathing was shallow and irregular, something she had never noticed in him before because vampires did not breathe the way humans did. They breathed when they chose to, when they spoke, or when they wanted to appear more approachable. Irregular breathing in a vampire was not a respiratory issue. It was structural. Something inside him was failing. His silver eyes found her face and sharpened with a reflexive pride that she found heartbreaking. You should not be here, he said. His voice was still low and controlled, still carrying that absolute authority that made the air feel heavier when he used it. But there was an edge beneath it, something thin and strained like ice over deep water. You said that the first night I worked here, Marina told him. She set her tray on a nearby table and looked at him directly, refusing to look away, refusing to perform the deference that everyone else in this room performed constantly. You were wrong then, too. Something moved through his expression. It was brief, and he suppressed it quickly, but she caught it. Warmth, surprise. A flicker of something almost like relief. Then he straightened, and the mask came back, and the room around them exhaled collectively, because the king was upright again. And the predators who had been circling went back to their conversations, and their drinks and their ancient political maneuverings. But Marina stayed where she was. And when his hand closed briefly around her wrist, not to feed, not with any hunger in it, only to steady himself for one single unguarded moment, she let him. She had known. Somewhere beneath the rational part of her brain that catalogued rent prices and nursing school rejection letters, and the precise caloric content of the meals she could afford on a waitress's salary, that something irrevocable had begun the night she walked into Obsidian. She had simply been waiting to find out what shape it would take. Now, watching the most powerful vampire in the northeastern half of the continent grip her wrist like she was the only solid thing in a dissolving world. She thought she understood. She understood, and she did not run. The night she had first come to Obsidian, 3.5 months ago, on a frozen February evening, Marina had been looking for a second job. Her actual reasons were boring and human and entirely her own. Student loan debt from 2 years of pre-med before she had run out of money, a gap in her health insurance, a landlord who had raised her rent for the 3rd time in 2 years. She had walked past the unmarked door on Van Torp Street a dozen times before she noticed the small card taped inside its darkened window. Night shift staff. No experience necessary. Discretion required. She had a gift for discretion. She had been keeping other people's secrets since she was 7 years old and had watched her mother cry in the kitchen and said nothing to anyone because she understood, instinctively, that some truths were not hers to share. The man who interviewed her had been Casimir Vrail, though she had not known his name then. He had looked at her steadily for a very long time, and then asked her a series of questions so oddly specific that she had later written them down to examine. Do you believe the world is larger than what you can see? Do you understand the difference between a secret kept for protection and a secret kept for control? Are you capable of continuing to perform your work while frightened? She had answered yes to all three without hesitation, and she had meant every word. She had been hired, given a substantial non-disclosure agreement that her gut told her was enforceable in ways well beyond the legal system, and introduced to the night shift. By her 3rd evening, she understood what Obsidian was. By her 4th, she had decided it did not change her answers. She had not spoken to Silas Skorzeny directly until the 5th week. He had come to the bar where she was working, settled onto one of the tall velvet stools with the unhurried ease of a man who owned the concept of time, and ordered scotch that she suspected he did not actually intend to drink. He had watched her work for 17 minutes. She had ignored him with such thorough professionalism that she heard one of the other vampires laugh somewhere behind her. "You are not afraid of me," he had said at last. "I did not say that," she had replied, not looking up from the glass she was polishing. "You did not have to say it. Your heartbeat would have told me. It is steady." Steady is not the same as unafraid. She had set the glass down and finally looked at him. "It means I have decided that fear is not useful right now." He had looked at her the way she imagined you might look at something you had not expected to find beautiful, carefully, as the star trying to determine if the beauty was real or a trick of the light. "What is your name?" he had asked. "Marina Whitlock, Marina." He had said it as though weighing it. "It means of the sea. I know what it means." The corner of his mouth had moved. Not quite a smile, something more private than that. "I am Silas Skorzeny. I know who you are, and you are still here." "Still here," she had agreed. He had left the scotch untouched and gone back to his court, and for 3 weeks after that he had watched her with those silver eyes from across the room while she did her job and refused to perform nervousness on his behalf. And then, gradually, the distance had begun to close. He came to the bar more often. He spoke to her. She spoke back honestly without the elaborate courtesy that the other staff used with him, because she had decided early on that performing smallness was both exhausting and pointless, and if the king of the northeastern court wanted someone to grovel, he would have to look elsewhere. He had not looked elsewhere. He had begun with the careful deliberateness of someone who had lived long enough to know that haste was the enemy of everything worthwhile, to seek her out, to ask her opinion on things. On the wine selection, initially, which she had no expertise in, but she had given him honest answers anyway. On the reconfiguration of the lower hall. On a dispute between 2 lesser vampires of his court that she had no business weighing in on. And yet he had listened to her assessment with such complete attention that she had felt, uncomfortably, that it mattered. She had begun to look forward to the nights he came to the bar. She had begun to dread the nights he did not. She had not called it love. She was too intelligent for comfortable self-deception. She had called it, privately, a catastrophic complication. Now, in the present, with his hand still wrapped around her wrist and his silver eyes closer to hers than they had ever been, Marina said quietly, under the noise of the room, "What is happening to you?" His jaw tightened. "That is not a question you are permitted to ask." "I am asking it anyway." The silence between them stretched. Around them, the court performed its elaborate normalcy, but Marina could feel the weight of attention on them, vampire senses tracking every word, Every heartbeat, every micro-expression, she kept her own face calm. "There is an old word for what is happening to me," Silas said at last, and his voice had dropped below what human ears other than hers could have caught from this distance. "The dimming. It is what happens to a vampire king when the blood covenant that sustains his rule has been broken." Marina processed this. Someone broke a covenant, betrayed it, deliberately and with considerable planning. His eyes moved across the room with the flat precision of a predator cataloging threats. "I do not yet know who. What does the dimming do?" "It unmakes me," he said, simply, as though discussing the weather. "Slowly, over weeks or months, the power recedes, the body begins to fail. Eventually I become something less than what I am, and then something less than that, until there is nothing left to recede." Marina absorbed this. She had learned in the past 4 months that panic was a luxury she could not afford in this world. Can it be reversed? The covenant must be restored. The oathbreaker must be identified and the betrayal formally acknowledged before the court of bloodlines. A pause. "It is considerably more complicated than it sounds. It sounds extremely complicated." "Yes, and while this is happening, while you are dimming," Marina said, "the other vampires in this room are watching to see if you are weak enough to unseat." The silver eyes came back to her. "You are perceptive." "I am practical," she corrected. "Is Casimir loyal to you?" Something moved through his expression. Uncertainty, she thought, though it sat strangely on a face built for absolute conviction. "I believed so. Now I am less certain. Who else do you trust completely?" At this moment, the almost smile appeared again, brief and painful and real in a way that made her chest ache. "You are asking that question while standing in the only position in this room where I let someone stand close to me." Marina looked at him. He looked back. Around them, the ancient court of the northeastern bloodlines moved and whispered and waited. "All right," she said. "All right, what? All right, I will help you." The mask slipped entirely for exactly 1 second. What was underneath it was something so raw and unguarded and utterly at odds with the composed sovereign she had spent 4 months watching that she had to look away for a moment to give him the privacy of it. When she looked back, he had himself in hand again. "You understand what that means," he said carefully. "In the context of this court, if the oathbreaker knows you are helping me, you become a target. I understood the risks of this job before I took it. Not these risks. Silas." She said his name the way she always said it, without the titles, without the elaborate architecture of deference, the way she said every name, directly and with the full weight of her attention behind it. "I have been standing in this room for 4 months. I know what you are. I know what they are. I am not operating on incomplete information." He was quiet for a long moment. Then, very quietly, he said something she had not heard him say before in any of their conversations, not once in all the weeks of scotch he did not drink, and questions he asked, and answers he listened to with that devastating completeness of attention. "Thank you," he said. She picked up her tray. "You're welcome. Now stop looking like you're about to dissolve and go sit on your throne before someone gets ideas." He did. He went and she watched his back as he crossed the room. Watched the court part for him with the automatic reverence of creatures trained by centuries of hierarchy. And she thought about oathbreakers and blood covenants and ancient dying kings. And she set her jaw and went back to work. The investigation, such as it was, began 3 nights later in a private room beneath the private room that most of the club's staff knew about. Marina had been there twice before, once to deliver a bottle of wine, and once because Silas had asked her to sit in on a meeting between 2 warring bloodline representatives, saying only that he wanted an observer whose biases were not encoded into the fabric of vampire politics. She had sat in the corner and taken mental notes and given him her assessment afterward, and he had listened with that focused, complete attention he gave everything she said, and then acted on 3 of her 4 observations. Tonight the room held 4 vampires and Marina. Silas sat at the head of the long obsidian table, and though the dimming was visibly progressing, the grey translucency spreading from his temples toward the planes of his cheekbones, he held himself with such absolute regal authority that the room arranged itself around him, as it always had. To his left sat Theodora Calvris, his oldest ally, a vampire of the eastern bloodlines who had white hair cropped close to her skull and amber eyes that Marina had once caught watching the room with the calculating precision of a chess player 12 moves ahead. To his right sat Renwick Galt, the court historian, ancient in a way that showed not in his face but in his hands, which were very still in the particular way of things that had been still for centuries. Across the table from Marina sat Casimir Vrail, whose dark eyes moved between her and Silas with an expression Marina was working to decode. "The blood covenant that sustains the king's rule," Renwick said, in a voice like old paper, "was a 4-party oath sworn at the foundation of the Northeastern Court. 4 bloodline heads pledged their sovereign power to the king in perpetuity. The oath is not symbolic, it is a living bond. If even one of the 4 breaks their pledge, the king's power begins to recede." "Which of the 4 bloodline heads is the oathbreaker?" Marina asked. Every vampire in the room looked at her. She was accustomed to being looked at in this room. She looked back. "We do not yet know," Theodora said. Her amber eyes were not unkind. "The covenant does not identify the source of the break. Only that it has occurred, then we need to find out," Marina said. "What are the 4 bloodlines?" Renwick listed them: Vrail, Calvris, Mordechai, and Ashenvine. Marina noted that Casimir's surname was Vrail. She noted that he did not react to this. She noted the absence of his reaction. "Can any of the 4 oath-givers identify the break themselves? Feel it somehow?" "An oath-giver who breaks their covenant," Renwick said slowly, as though the question had not occurred to him before in quite this form, would be able to feel the severance, a sensation of release like a cord cut, so they know they did it. "Yes." "Then the question is not which of them broke the covenant," Marina said. "The question is which of them wanted to break it badly enough to accept the consequences and what they expected to gain." She looked at Silas. "Who benefits from your dimming? Who inherits your court if you die?" The silence in the room was different from ordinary silence. It had weight and texture, and a history she could not fully access. "The court reverts to a 4-bloodline council," Silas said. "Each head rules in their own territory. There is no single king. So all 4 of them benefit, yes, but only one of them broke the oath." Marina leaned forward slightly. "Which means the other 3 are either loyal or simply slower to act, and the oathbreaker has been in this room in the past few minutes. So," she said, and looked at Casimir Vrail with a steadiness she did not entirely feel. "What sensation did you notice approximately 6 weeks ago that felt like something being released?" The room went very, very still. Casimir's expression did not change. That, she thought, was its own kind of answer. "You have no standing to accuse me," he said pleasantly. "I am not accusing you," Marina said. "I am asking you a question. You can tell me the answer, or you can tell Silas, or you can choose not to answer at all, which is also an answer." Casimir turned to Silas. "You allow a human waitress to conduct interrogations on your behalf." "I allow Marina Whitlock to speak," Silas said, and his voice was quiet and absolute and carried the full remaining weight of his diminished but still terrifying authority. "Because she says things worth hearing, answer her." Casimir Vrail was very old. He had the stillness of something that had survived by calculating odds across centuries. Marina watched him calculate now, watched the rapid internal weighing of options, and she knew before he spoke what he had decided. "I did not break the covenant," he said, and he was telling the truth. Marina was good at reading people. It was the same skill that had gotten her through 2 years of pre-med on instinct and determination, and the ability to know within seconds which patients in a waiting room were deteriorating, and which professors were genuinely engaged, and which classmates were struggling beneath a composed surface. She read Casimir Vrail and she believed him, which meant she had been wrong and she needed to say so. "I believe you," she said. He blinked. She suspected Casimir Vrail did not encounter the word believe in this context very often. "Then the Vrail bloodline is intact," Silas said. "Intact and loyal," Casimir said, and there was something in his voice that might have been relief, or might have been the shadow of an old offense at having been suspected. "I would not. Whatever we disagree on, I would not." Marina was already moving on. "Calvris, Mordechai, Ashenvine. Theodora is Calvris and is sitting here, which suggests either she is innocent or she is extremely bold. Where are the heads of Mordechai and Ashenvine?" "Lord Emrith Mordechai," Renwick said slowly, "is in the city. He attended court last week, and Ashenvine," a pause. "Lady Veska Ashenvine," Theodora said, "has not attended court in 7 weeks." Marina looked at Silas. Silas looked at the table for a moment, and she could see him working through it, working through the implications of 7 weeks, working through what it meant that Veska Ashenvine had removed herself from court precisely as the dimming began, and she watched his face as he arrived at the same place she had. She ran, he said. Or she is preparing something, Marina said. Running and preparing are not mutually exclusive. She paused. What did she want that you would not give her? Another of those charged silences. Theodora and Casimir exchanged a look that Marina catalogued for later examination. Veska Ashenvine, Silas said carefully, wished to formalize an alliance between our courts through a bond I was unwilling to enter. A political marriage, Marina said. Yes, and you refused. I refused. Marina nodded. She kept her face very neutral and her voice very practical, and she absolutely did not examine why the confirmation that he had refused settled into her chest like something warm and steady. Then she broke the covenant as leverage, Marina said, or as punishment. Either way, she still has the power to restore it if she acknowledges the breach before the court of bloodlines. The question is how you find her and convince her to do that before the dimming becomes irreversible. The court of bloodlines, Renwick said, and his ancient voice had taken on a careful quality, can only be convened by all 4 bloodline heads in agreement. It requires Veska Ashenvine's physical presence. So we need to find her, Marina said, and bring her in. We, Silas repeated. She met his eyes. Yes, we. They found Veska Ashenvine in 12 days. 12 days was not a long time in human terms, but it was a very long time when the person you were trying to save was visibly failing. Marina watched Silas across those 12 days with the careful attention she gave to everything important, and she tracked the progression of the dimming the way she had once been taught to track symptom progression in clinical settings. Methodically, without panic, noting changes and adapting her responses. By the 4th day, the grey had reached his cheekbones. By the 8th, it had extended to his jaw and his hands. By the 10th, he had to sit down twice during meetings he would previously have conducted standing. He never complained. He never asked for accommodation. He pushed through with a grim and absolute pride that she found both admirable and infuriating, because pride she had learned from watching human patients in emergency rooms was the emotion most likely to kill you. She told him so on the 10th night, when she found him in his private office off the throne room at 2 in the morning, attempting to review a stack of bloodline correspondence that his hands were too unsteady to properly manage. You are going to sit down, she said, and took the papers from him before he could protest. And you are going to let me read these to you, and you are not going to make this into something about dignity. He looked at her. Sit down, Silas. He sat down. It cost him something. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the barely perceptible tightening at the corners of his eyes. He had been sitting in this office, in this chair, in this court, for longer than any living human institution had existed. Being told to sit down by a 26-year-old waitress from Brooklyn was not, she imagined, a common experience. She sat across from him and began reading the correspondence aloud, and he listened with his silver eyes on her face and his hands flat on the desk, and somewhere in the middle of the 3rd document he said very quietly, "Why do you stay?" She looked up. "In the job? In this with me. You are not bound here. You could walk away from this court and this disaster and this world and go back to the one you came from, and nothing and no one would stop you." Marina set the papers down. She thought about what to say, and she chose honesty the way she always chose it, because it was the only currency she trusted in this place. "Because you are worth staying for," she said. "Because you are fair, even when it costs you. Because you listened to me when you did not have to and gave me a place in a room where I had no right to be. Because when I read people, I am rarely wrong, and I have been reading you for 4 months, and what I see is someone who deserves to survive this." His silver eyes were very still. "That is a dangerously kind thing to say to a vampire king," he said. "Good thing I am not afraid of danger," she said, and picked the papers back up. They did not speak again for a long time. But when she finished the correspondence and stood to leave, his hand moved across the desk, and his fingers touched the back of her hand very lightly, briefly, and she felt the warmth of it all the way home. At 4 in the morning, and into the grey November dawn, they found Veska Ashenvine through Renwick, who knew more about the movement of old bloodlines than any other creature in the court. And through Marina, who had spent an evening cross-referencing property records and registered business entities with the patience of someone used to finding things in incomplete datasets. Veska had a property in an old warehouse district 3 miles from the court, registered under a shell corporation that was 2 steps removed from her name. Marina found the chain in 4 hours with a laptop and a legal research subscription she paid for herself. Silas looked at the printed document she put in front of him and said, with a feeling she recognized as something adjacent to awe, "How did you find this?" "The same way I found everything else in this situation," Marina said. "I looked." The retrieval of Veska Ashenvine was dangerous and Marina was not invited to come. A decision that led to the most direct confrontation she had yet had with Silas Skorzeny in 4 months of accumulating direct confrontations. "You are not coming," he said. "I am," she said, Marina, and his voice dropped into that low particular register that she understood was reserved for moments of absolute seriousness. "What we are walking into is not a negotiation. It may become a fight. Vampires will be injured or worse. You are human, and I will not be able to protect you adequately in my current condition. And if something happens to you because I brought you into a situation I could not control, I will not." He stopped. She waited. "I will not recover from that," he finished. Quietly, the honesty of it made her chest tighten, in a way she had stopped pretending was about anything other than what it was. "Silas," she said, "I am not going to be in the fight. I am going to be the reason she talks. Because you need her to agree to appear before the court of bloodlines, and you cannot compel her to agree without it looking like coercion and undermining the legitimacy of the covenant restoration. But I can talk to her, and I am good at it." He looked at her for a long time. The grey had reached the hollow beneath his left cheekbone. She tracked it and said nothing because saying something would not slow it down, and what they needed was Veska Ashenvine. "You stay behind me until the location is secured," he said. "Agreed. You do not engage with any vampire other than Ashenvine without my explicit instruction." "Agreed, and if I tell you to leave, you leave immediately, without argument." "If you tell me to leave, I will leave as quickly as I can determine it is actually necessary," Marina said. "I will not promise immediate compliance on a condition I cannot evaluate in advance." Another silence. "You are the most obstinate person I have encountered in several centuries," he said. "I know," she said. "Let us go get your covenant restored." The warehouse was exactly as the property records had implied. Large, industrial, retrofitted with the careful attention to Gothic detail that Marina had come to recognize as the aesthetic preference of old-world vampires who had been reluctant to leave the architecture of previous centuries behind. Stone floors. High arched windows painted black from the inside. Chandeliers that had no business being in a warehouse and were there anyway. Burning with cold blue-white light, Veska Ashenvine was waiting for them. This was not a surprise. Marina had factored it into her assessment of the situation. A vampire who had spent weeks preparing a position of leverage did not get surprised by her opponent's arrival. She got ready for it. Veska was extraordinary to look at, even by vampire standards. Taller than Marina had expected, with white hair that fell in a straight curtain to her waist and eyes the color of old amber, and a manner that conveyed centuries of absolute authority in every infinitesimal shift of posture. She looked at Silas with the composed contempt of a woman who has been refused something she considered rightfully hers. She looked at Marina with considerably more uncertainty, which Marina appreciated as an advantage. "You brought a human," Veska said. "He brought me," Marina said pleasantly. "I appreciate the distinction." Veska's amber eyes moved between them with sharp assessment. "The waitress," she said. "I have heard about you. I hope it was accurate." It was. A pause. "The reports failed to mention that you are either remarkably brave or remarkably uninformed about the situation you are in." "I prefer informed," Marina said. "You broke the blood covenant that sustains Silas Skorzeny's rule because he refused to marry you. You have been running the dimming for 7 weeks. You know it is irreversible after 3 months, which means you still have time to restore it, which means you have not fully committed to letting him die. That means you want something, and you believe you can still get it." Veska was very still. "The marriage is no longer on the table," Marina continued. It was never the right solution, and I think some part of you knows that because you are intelligent. What you actually wanted was recognition, security for the Ashenvine bloodline, a formal position in the court's power structure that acknowledges your line standing. You presume to speak for what I want, Veska said. I am telling you what I see, Marina said. Tell me if I am wrong. A long pause. The Ashenvine line is the eldest, Veska said, and we have been treated as the least. Then let us fix that, Marina said, formally, before the court of bloodlines, in writing and in blood, with Silas Skorzeny's signature and the signatures of all 3 other bloodline heads. She glanced at Silas, who was watching this exchange with a focused attention that she could feel on her skin. Silas, can you offer a formal charter of standing for the Ashenvine bloodline, a recognized seat on the court council, equal vote in all bloodline matters, acknowledged precedence in Eastern Territory negotiations? A moment, then, yes. That is not what I asked for, Veska said, but her voice had changed. No, Marina agreed. It is better, because a marriage creates a bond that can be dissolved, but a charter creates a legal and spiritual structure that outlasts any one relationship. Your bloodline is protected by institution rather than by your personal connection to a single king. It cannot be taken from you the way a marriage can end. She paused. And you do not have to spend the next 5 centuries married to someone who did not choose you. The silence that followed was different from the others. Veska Ashenvine looked at Marina Whitlock for a very long time. You are remarkably good at this, she said finally. I know, Marina said. Will you come to the Court of Bloodlines? Another pause. Veska looked at Silas. Something passed between them, old and complicated and heavy with the history of centuries. If the charter is genuine, Veska said. It will be, Silas said. I give my word, then I will come. The Court of Bloodlines was convened 4 days later in the chamber beneath obsidian that Marina had not known existed until the night Renwick led her down 3 flights of stone stairs behind a door that she had assumed was a supply closet for 4 months. The chamber was vast and old in a way that made the warehouse look newly built. The stone walls were carved with a continuous relief of bloodline histories, figures and symbols, and ancient script that Marina could not read but felt the weight of. 4 thrones, identical in size and style, stood in a semicircle. Above them, suspended on nothing Marina could identify, floated an orb of deep red light that Renwick told her was the Covenant itself, given visible form. It was cracked down the middle, and the crack pulsed with a darkness that made the air near it feel thin and wrong. Silas stood at the center of the chamber, looking like a man who might not have enough time left to get through this. He was markedly worse. The grey had consumed most of his visible skin now. His hair, always purely white, had taken on a deeper pallor that went past white into something closer to transparency at the edges. He moved with the careful deliberateness of someone managing pain, though he would never say so. Marina stood at the outer edge of the chamber, where Casimir had placed her with a look that said very clearly that this was as far as she went, and she watched Silas take the center of the room with absolute regal authority, despite everything his body was doing, and she felt something so fierce and protective rise in her chest that she had to breathe carefully for a moment to keep it contained. She was in love with him. She was completely, unreservedly, and entirely practically in love with Silas Skorzeny, and she was choosing to sit with that knowledge now in this ancient chamber, because there was no point in pretending otherwise any longer, and because pretending things were not real had never once in her life made them less real. She watched him hold himself together with his pride and his centuries and whatever remained of his diminished power, and she thought, survive this. Survive this and we will figure out the rest. The 4 bloodline heads took their places. Emrith Mordechai, a compact vampire with iron-dark hair and careful eyes, who had been found loyal when Silas quietly verified his oath in the days preceding the convening. Theodora Calvris, steady and amber-eyed. Casimir Vrail, whose expression had settled into something Marina read as resolved. And Veska Ashenvine, white-haired and composed, who had arrived with a formality that suggested she had decided on the dignity of restoration. Renwick read the covenant terms, the charter terms, the acknowledgement of breach. The chamber required the oath-breakers' formal acknowledgement spoken aloud before the covenant could be restored. Veska stood. Her amber eyes were on the cracked red orb above them. In the cold light of the chamber she looked very old and very proud, and, Marina thought, not entirely unlike someone who had been carrying something heavy for a very long time and was glad to be able to set it down. "I acknowledge the breach," Veska Ashenvine said in a voice that carried through the chamber like struck crystal. The Ashenvine bloodline broke its sovereign oath to Silas Skorzeny of the Northeastern Court. The breach is named, witnessed, and regretted. The orb blazed. It went from cracked and dark to fully illuminated in the space of one heartbeat, red gold and blazing, and the crack sealed itself in light, and the sound it made was not a sound exactly but a pressure, a resonance that Marina felt in her sternum like a deep bell struck at the frequency of something very old and very certain. And Silas straightened, not gradually, not slowly. In one moment he was grey and failing and held together by will, and in the next the colour came back to his skin, the translucency receded. The silver of his eyes brightened from the flat grey of illness to the sharp, brilliant silver she had first seen from across a bar 4 months ago. He stood in the centre of the chamber and breathed with the steady, unhurried ease of something fully restored, and the power came off him in waves that even Marina, human and limited to human senses, could feel in the hair on her arms. He turned and his eyes found her immediately, across the chamber, past all the ancient vampires, and all the carved bloodline history, and all the floating covenant light. She smiled at him. He held her gaze for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than it needed to for any practical purpose. Then the court moved around them, and the charter signing began, and the world went back to its complicated and ancient business. The aftermath of the Covenant restoration took another 2 weeks to fully settle. There were political consequences, negotiations, formal all-ceremonies that Marina understood in outline, but not in detail, the elaborate machinery of a supernatural court reconfiguring around a restored sovereign. Veska Ashenvine was formally granted the Charter of Standing. Emrith Mordechai attended court for the first time in a month. Casimir Vrail, whose loyalty had never actually been in question, but who had nonetheless spent a tense week under suspicion, he bore with remarkable patience. Returned to his role with a precision and efficiency that Marina suspected was partly an expression of relief. Marina went back to work. She made drinks and carried trays and kept secrets and did all the things she had been doing for 4 months, except that now the court looked at her differently. Not because her status had changed. She was still a human waitress with student loan debt and a gap in her health insurance. But the court had watched her walk towards a failing king when every other creature in the room was edging away, had watched her identify an oath-breaker, had watched her talk a wronged and angry vampire out of a chamber she had barricaded herself into. And ancient creatures who respected power recognized its presence in unexpected containers. They did not grovel. Vampires did not grovel. But Casimir Vrail held the door for her once, and Theodora Calvris brought her a glass of something extremely expensive and set it on her tray without a word. And Renwick, who had never spoken to her except to answer direct questions, stopped her one evening and said, in his old paper voice, that she had done well. She said thank you and meant it and went back to work. Silas himself was more complicated. He was restored, entirely, the dimming fully reversed. His power and his presence returned to the levels that made rooms rearrange themselves around him and ancient vampires watch their words. He was the king of the Northeastern Court again in every sense, and the court responded to him accordingly. And Marina watched this from her usual positions behind the bar, or moving through the room with her tray, and she felt the space between them as a specific and distinct ache, because she had been necessary during the crisis. She had been in those rooms at that table, in that warehouse. She had been part of the solution in a direct and meaningful way, and now the crisis was over, and she was a waitress again, and he was a vampire king, and the distance between those two things was measurable in centuries. She was not the kind of person who rewrote reality to suit what she wanted. She had been doing this long enough to know that what she felt was real and what was possible was a separate question. She resolved the question the only way she knew how, which was to work, and to give him the space he had not asked for, but which she suspected was appropriate, and to take exactly one evening in her apartment to sit with the grief of it before putting it away. She was in the middle of that one evening. sitting on her fire escape with a mug of tea at 11 at night, and looking at the city lights below her and being extremely practical and reasonable about all of it when her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Unknown number. She answered it. "Where are you?" Silas said. She blinked. "How did you get this number?" "Casimir provided it." "Where are you?" "I am sitting on my fire escape. Do not move." The call ended. She sat on her fire escape for 17 minutes, holding her cooling mug of tea, and wondering if she was about to be in a position she was not ready for. And then the shadow across her from above, and she looked up. He had come from the roof. He descended to the fire escape with a fluid, unhurried grace that she had seen him apply to every physical movement, and settled beside her on the iron railing with the ease of someone who had been doing this for longer than fire escapes had existed. He was in his usual white, the silver of his eyes bright in the city-lit darkness, fully restored, fully himself, impossibly present. He looked out at the city. She waited. "I owe you," he said. "You do not," she said. "I helped because I wanted to. Debts are not the reason I do things. I know that." He was quiet for a moment. "That is part of what I wanted to say. You are unlike anything I have encountered in a very long time, Marina, possibly ever." He looked at her, and the silver eyes were completely unguarded, in a way she had seen only twice before. Once in the throne room, when she said she would help him, and once in the private office, when she told him he was worth staying for. "I have been many things in many centuries. I have been a king and a fighter and a sovereign and a survivor. I have not in a very long time been known." Marina set down her mug. "You know me," he said. "You knew the crisis before I named it. You knew the oathbreaker before I could see it. You knew what I could offer Veska Ashenvine before I did. And in all of that knowing, you never once looked at me, as though what you found was less than what you expected." A pause. "That is not a small thing." "No," Marina agreed. "It is not." "I am not entirely certain," he said carefully, "how to proceed with something I have not navigated before. The laws of my court are not designed for this. The blood laws are not designed for this. There is no protocol for a vampire king and a waitress," Marina said. "A remarkable and infuriating and wholly extraordinary person," he corrected. "Who happens to work as a waitress?" She looked at him. He looked at her. The city moved and breathed below them, completely indifferent to ancient covenants and blood laws, and two people sitting on a fire escape in November, working out the geometry of something unprecedented. "The blood laws," Marina said. "What do they actually prohibit?" "They prohibit formal bonds between vampires and humans in court contexts. Political marriages, covenant binding." He paused. "They do not prohibit two individuals from choosing each other." "Then the laws are not the problem." "The laws are not the problem," he agreed. "What is the problem?" He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than most of his silences, which was how she knew this was the one he had been working up to. "I will not grow old," he said. "You will. I will not change. You will. I have watched this particular arithmetic destroy people who went in knowing the odds, and I am not certain I can watch it with you. I am not certain I can stand at sufficient distance from this outcome to be rational about it." Marina thought about this. She gave it the full weight of her attention. "That is a real problem," she said. "Yes, it is also," she said, "a problem that exists in the future and that we cannot solve tonight. And in my experience, declining to begin something real because of a future problem you cannot solve yet is simply another word for fear." She paused. "I did not take you for someone who let fear make decisions." He looked at her for a long time. "You are going to say something about obstinacy," she said. "I was," he agreed. Something happened in his expression, something she had been waiting to see fully and had only caught in glimpses before. The smile arrived. Not the almost smile she had catalogued over months. The real one. It changed his entire face, moved through it like light through water, and she felt it somewhere below her ribs like a key turning in a lock. "Most people who speak to me the way you speak to me," he said, "do not do so for very long." "I am not most people." "No," he said. "You are entirely yourself, and that is both the simplest and most compelling thing about you." He reached out and took her hand with the same care he had used in the throne room, holding her wrist not to feed, not with any hunger in it, but with something that said solid ground. She held back. "I am not going to pretend I know how this works," she said honestly. "I have never done this. I do not have a framework for it." "Neither do I," he said, Not in this form. Then we will make one. He looked at her hand in his, at the very ordinary human contrast of her skin against his white pale fingers, and she watched him decide something. She could see it in the shift of his posture, the specific quality of his stillness, changing from held back to certain. Yes, he said. We will.
Will.
She leaned her head against his shoulder, which was an entirely impractical place to lean in terms of temperature and material, his white coat being somewhat formal and considerably colder than she was. But it was where she wanted to be, and she had decided some time ago that impractical was not the same as wrong. He did not move away. After a moment, his arm settled around her shoulders with the careful deliberateness he applied to everything important. And they sat on her fire escape in November and looked at the city together. The months that followed were not simple. Nothing involving the intersection of a human world and a vampire court was ever going to be simple, and Marina had never been the kind of person who mistook complexity for impossibility. There were things she had to learn, and she learned them with the same methodical practicality she applied to everything. The court's blood laws in detail, so she understood which applied to her and which did not. The hierarchy of the bloodlines and the implications of her position as someone formally acknowledged to have standing in the court, not as a vampire, not as a political figure, but as someone the king trusted explicitly, which turned out to carry more weight than she had initially appreciated. The rhythms of the court's seasons, which did not correspond to human seasons in any reliable way, but followed instead the patterns of old-world bloodline politics, feasts and formal gatherings and periods of internal arbitration. She also went back to school. This had been her plan before Obsidian, and the plan had not changed just because she had found herself in the middle of a vampire political crisis. She enrolled in evening nursing courses at a city college, rearranging her shifts at Obsidian to accommodate the schedule. Silas did not tell her not to, which she had not expected him to, but he did spend an evening reading her enrollment documents with an expression of focused attention that she recognized as concern operating through the medium of thoroughness. The program is 3 years, he said. Yes, the cost is considerable. I am managing it. A pause. I manage my own finances, Marina said, but thank you. He had looked at her with the expression she had come to think of as the one that meant he was recalibrating, adjusting his instincts to the specific reality of who she was rather than the general category of person he might have assumed her to occupy. He did this regularly. It was one of the things she found most genuinely compelling about him. The willingness to adjust, to receive information about her and incorporate it, to treat her as a complete and specific person rather than a type. She was aware that this was not a small thing in an ancient being. Old things tended toward fixed frameworks. He was old enough that his willingness to bend his frameworks for her was a form of devotion she felt more deeply than she could easily articulate. She told him so once. Approximately 8 months after the fire escape evening, in the office beneath Obsidian, where she had read him bloodline correspondence on the night, everything had clarified between them. She had been reviewing her nursing notes at the desk across from him, while he worked through court documents, a domestic scene so improbable in its setting that she had caught herself smiling at it. He had looked up and asked what was funny. She had said nothing was funny, and then, after a moment, had said, I was thinking about what it means that you listen to me, that you change how you think about things because of what I say. I was trying to find the right word for it. What word did you find? He asked. Devotion, she said, which I was not expecting to use about this. He had set down his pen. I was not expecting to experience it, he said. That makes 2 of us. She had crossed the office and kissed him, which was the first time she had done this and which she had been thinking about for approximately 5 months with the portion of her brain that ran beneath the surface of daily practicality. He had kissed her back with a care and an intensity that managed to be both at the same time, and when they finally separated, he had looked at her with those silver eyes bright and clear and completely unguarded, and she thought, there it is. There is what has been underneath all of it from the beginning. Love, in this form, was not simple. It was the particular complexity of 2 people from very different worlds building a shared space at the precise intersection of those worlds. There were blood laws she had to understand and then human systems she had to navigate. There were nights he could not be what she needed because the court required something she had no access to, and there were days she could not reach him because the human world moved in rhythms that did not map to the rhythms of his life. There were moments of genuine difficulty, moments where the difference between mortal and immortal was not abstract but specific and sharp and required conversation. They had those conversations. That was the thing she had come to understand about him. The thing she had suspected from the first night he sat at her bar and ordered scotch he did not intend to drink. He was not afraid of the true conversation. He had centuries of practice choosing easy ones, deflecting with authority or silence or regal distance, and he chose not to do any of those things with her. When there was something difficult to say, he said it. When there was something he did not understand about her world, he asked. When she pushed back on him, he did not retreat into his authority, or his age, or his power. He engaged. She would take that over almost anything. 1 year after the night of the dimming, Marina came to Obsidian on an evening that was not her scheduled shift, and went directly to Silas's private office, where she knocked, which she did not usually bother with. He opened the door and looked at her with immediate alert attention, because in 4 months of not knocking she had never knocked before. "I passed," she said. He looked at her. "My nursing boards," she said. "I passed." She had not realized until the word left her mouth how much she had needed to say it, had been carrying the result home on the subway with the certificate in her bag, and the number of things she wanted to say to him rising with every stop. He reached for her immediately, pulled her into the office and closed the door, and held her with both arms, which was not a thing he did lightly or often, and she pressed her face against the white of his coat and breathed and felt the warmth of it settle around her like something absolute. "Of course you did," he said against her hair. "Was there ever any doubt?" "Plenty," she admitted. "I am very good at doubt. You are very good at everything," he said, "including doubt." She laughed, which was not something she did easily in professional contexts, but was something that had become entirely natural in this office with this impossible man. She pulled back and looked at him, and he was looking at her the way he looked at her when he thought she was not watching, with the full unguarded weight of everything he felt. And she thought, "I am going to spend a very long time being looked at like that, and I am not going to take it for granted." "I have been thinking," she said, "about what I said on the fire escape, about problems that exist in the future." "I think about it regularly," he said. "The arithmetic between us," she said. "The aging question, yes. I know there are blood laws about formal bonding," she said carefully. "And I know I told you once that I handle my own situation. But I also know that there are ways in this world, your world, that the arithmetic can be changed. I am not asking you to change it. I am asking you whether it is something you would be willing to discuss with me, as a discussion between two people who are going to figure this out together." He was very still. "Are you asking me what I think you are asking me?" "I am asking about options," she said. "I am not making demands. I am not romanticizing it. I know what it would cost in every sense. I am asking because I want to know if it is something you would consider, if I decided it was something I wanted." Silas Skorzeny, king of the northeastern court, ancient and sovereign and restored, looked at her with his silver eyes full of the kind of love that only became possible when someone stopped being afraid of it. "I have been considering it," he said carefully, "since the fire escape evening, not because I assume you want it. Because I cannot imagine a future that does not include you in it, and I have been trying to determine how to raise it without sounding as though I am making a claim on your choices." Marina looked at him. "You are the most decent person I have ever met," she said, "human or otherwise. You set a low bar. I set an extremely high one," she said. "You should know that by now." He took both her hands in his and held them the way he had held her wrist in the throne room, on the night she had walked toward a failing king when everyone else stepped back, with the same care, the same steadiness, the same quality of treating the thing in his hands as something of irreplaceable value. "We will discuss it," he said. "Every angle, every cost, every alternative, all of it together, with no decision made until you are certain." "And if I decide I want it," Marina said, "then I will make it happen," he said, "with every old world code and blood law and ancient resource at my disposal. And if I decide I do not," she said, "if I decide the human life is the right one, all the way through, Then, he said, and his voice was completely steady, we will spend every year of it together that you have, and I will consider myself among the most fortunate beings in any world. She looked at him for a long moment. Then she said, I think I already know what I want. Tell me. I want this, she said, all of it. The long version. He closed his eyes briefly, and when he opened them, she saw something in the silver depths of them that she had never seen there before, not in all the months of watching him. Pure, uncomplicated relief. The kind that only comes when someone who has been braced for loss finds out they do not have to lose. The long version, he said. The long version, she confirmed. He kissed her with a thoroughness and tenderness that she would think about for a very long time afterward, and when the kiss ended, he was still holding both her hands, and she was still looking at him, and outside the office, the ancient court of the northeastern bloodlines moved through its eternal rhythms, and inside the office it was just the two of them, mortal and immortal and entirely each other's. The formal process, when they eventually undertook it, was neither quick nor simple. It required the unanimous agreement of the 4 bloodline heads, a formal presentation before the court of bloodlines, 3 separate ancient rites that Renwick explained to Marina, with the careful thoroughness she had come to treasure in him, and 1 very long evening of conversation in which Marina asked every question she could think of, and Silas answered each one with complete honesty. The bloodline heads, it turned out, were less resistant than Marina had expected. Theodora Calvris said that Marina had already demonstrated sufficient standing in the court to make the question essentially academic. Emreth Mordechai said nothing, but signed the agreement with the same compact efficiency he brought to everything. Casimir Vrel said, in a tone that was the closest Marina had ever heard him come to warmth, that he had suspected this would be the outcome since the night Marina walked across the throne room toward a failing king without breaking stride. Veska Ashenvine, whose charter had been honored in every particular as promised, and whose Ashenvine bloodline now held formal standing in the court council, said only that she hoped Marina understood what she was choosing. Marina said she did. Veska looked at her for a moment with amber eyes that were not unkind and said, "Good," and signed the document. The rites themselves were held in the chamber beneath Obsidian, the same chamber where the blood covenant had been restored, where the carved bloodline histories watched from the walls and the covenant orb burned steady red gold above the 4 thrones. Marina stood in the center of that ancient room and made her choices with full knowledge of what they meant, and Silas stood beside her with a composure that only broke once, briefly, at the end when Marina looked up at him after the final rite was complete and said, "Well, we did it." His face did what it had done on the fire escape when she leaned her head against his shoulder, opened entirely into something she thought few people had ever been allowed to see. He took her face in both his hands with the care of someone holding something irreplaceable. "We did it," he said. "The long version," Marina said. "The long version," he agreed. Outside, the city breathed and moved through its human night, unaware that beneath one of its older buildings, something ancient and new had just been made at the same time, that a king had been found by the right person at the exact right moment, that a woman who had walked into a world of ancient power and blood law and immortal pride had kept her feet under her, and her eyes open and her voice steady, and had found, at the center of all of it, something she had not been looking for, and could not imagine relinquishing. Marina Whitlock had walked into a room full of vampires and refused to perform fear, and in doing so, had walked toward the only thing in that world worth walking toward. And Silas Skorzeny, who had been fading into shadow, who had been dissolving at the edges of everything he was, and everything he had built, across centuries of absolute and solitary sovereignty, had been pulled back into the light by a 26-year-old waitress from Brooklyn, who read people accurately, made decisions in the absence of complete information, and had never once into life let fear make her choices for her. He had told her once on a night, much later, lying in the still hours of the deep morning with the city quiet outside, and her nursing textbooks stacked on the nightstand and his court documents on the desk, considerably better at being alive than he had been before her. She had said, "You were always good at it. You just needed someone to tell you so." He had looked at her with those silver eyes, full and warm and entirely unguarded. "You," he had said, "not someone, You, and she had said, yes, exactly, me, and she had meant it with everything she had, every sensible and practical and deeply human piece of her, and he had known it, and they had both understood. In the way of people who have found the specific and unrepeatable person they were always headed toward without knowing it, that this was the place where everything made sense. Not simple sense. Not easy sense. The complicated, costly, completely worthwhile sense of two people who had chosen each other in full possession of the facts, who had built something real at the intersection of two worlds, who had decided that the arithmetic of mortal and immortal was not a tragedy but a problem they would solve together. 1 year at a time, and then every year after that, Marina became a nurse. She worked in a hospital 2 evenings a week and at Obsidian on the others, and she kept the secret of that second world with the same absolute discretion she had promised on the night she was hired, and she was very good at both lives, and she did not find them contradictory. The court became, over time, the kind of place that adjusted itself around her the way places adjust around people who have made themselves genuinely necessary. Not by diminishing itself, but by expanding to include her. Renwick gave her access to the library beneath Obsidian, which contained, among other things, the complete documented history of every bloodline negotiation for the past 800 years. And Marina read it with the same methodical thoroughness she applied to her nursing coursework, and used the things she learned to become increasingly useful in bloodline disputes that had nothing to do with her by origin and everything to do with her by choice. Casimir Vrail eventually told her, in a moment of something that functioned as confession, that he had worried initially about her influence, that he had assumed her presence near the king was a temporary disruption, a human entanglement that would resolve itself when the novelty faded. He said that he had been wrong on every count, and that being wrong had been genuinely instructive, and that he was glad of it. Marina told him she appreciated the honesty and poured him a drink, and Casimir Vrail, who had lived for centuries and had never apologized to a human being before in any of them, sat at the bar and drank it. The covenant orb above the 4 thrones in the Court of Bloodlines burned steady and whole and complete, as it had burned since the night Veska Ashenvine spoke her acknowledgement into the old stone air. The bloodlines kept their oaths. The court kept its politics. Ancient creatures navigated centuries with the careful deliberateness of things that have learned the cost of haste. And in the office, beneath the office, in the underground chambers that held the oldest parts of what Silas Skorzeny had built across more years than most human institutions had existed, a king sat across us from the woman he loved while she studied, and he governed, and the city moved above them. And he thought, with the full weight of centuries behind the thought, that he had been many things across many years, but that he had not known, until now, what it meant to have something he would not trade. Not the court, not the covenant, not the bloodline power or the ancient sovereignty or the regal authority that had defined him since before most of the world's cities existed. This specific and improbable and entirely real thing. Marina looked up from her textbook and caught him watching her. She'd caught him watching her many times, and she had catalogued every expression, and this one she knew best of all, because it was the one he kept for her, specifically. "You are staring," she said. "I am," he agreed. "Is there something you need?" "Nothing," he said. "I have everything I need." She looked at him for a moment with those steady brown eyes that had looked at him without flinching, since the first night she stood behind a bar and refused to perform smallness on his behalf. Then she smiled, and it was the smile that had been pulling him toward the light since the night he had stood in his own throne room and felt himself dissolving. The smile that meant, "I see you, and I am not afraid of what I see, and I am staying." "Good," she said, and went back to her textbook. And outside, the city breathed, and inside the old stone chambers beneath it, the light held.